signed an armistice agreement with North Korea and China, ending the Korean War that had been raging for 3 years. That ceasefire has stood ever since, but no peace treaty has ever been signed, meaning technically the two Koreas still remain at war. However, recent events on the Korean Peninsula have renewed hope that perhaps that situation could finally change. North Korea has started to show signs that it's dismantling its nuclear facilities, and earlier today, as promised with President Trump last month, it handed over several remains of US soldiers killed in the Korean War. There's still a long way to go, but perhaps soon we will no longer be celebrating the anniversary of an armistice, but of peace on the Korean Peninsula. We'll discuss the significance of today's anniversary with a guest in the studio later, but first, Devin Whiting at their news centre has the latest updates at this hour. Devin?
Hi, Jang-ho. That's right. North Korea, during its summit with the United States, promised to return the remains of American soldiers who never made it back from the Korean War, and today it started following through. It's the first time, in fact, that it's handed over remains of U.S. soldiers in 11 years. EG1 has the latest.
The remains of American soldiers killed on the northern side of the Korean Peninsula during the Korean War have been returned after more than 60 years. A U.S. Air Force C-17 aircraft took off from Osan Air Base in South Korea early Friday morning, bound for Wonsan, North Korea, and returned at about 11 a.m. with the remains on board. The 55 caskets draped in UN flags were carried out of the plane and loaded onto vans by honor guards from UN Command. Though not a formal ceremony, some 1,000 service members, U.S. officials, and their families were at the site on Friday to honor and show respect to the fallen heroes. United States Forces Korea Commander General Vincent Brooks said that it was a successful mission following extensive coordination and that they will now prepare to honor the fallen before they're sent on their journey home. In the next 5 days or so, a team of American forensic specialists will do an in-depth examination of the remains, looking for any identification like dog tags or uniforms. An official repatriation ceremony will be held at the airbase on August 1st, just before the remains are flown to Hawaii for DNA identification, which will take months. With this, the number of soldiers whose remains have been recovered from the north since the 1990s will be closer to 700, up from the 635 already confirmed. White House released a statement saying that North Korean leader Kim Jong has fulfilled part of the commitment he made to President Donald Trump, and that the U.S. is encouraged by Pyongyang's actions and the momentum for positive change. Washington also noted that the event represents a significant first step toward resuming both the repatriation of remains from North Korea and field operations to find the other 5,000 still there. President Trump also thanked the North Korean leader on Twitter, adding that after so many years, this will be a great moment for so many families. South Korea's foreign ministry also warmly welcomed the repatriation and evaluated it as a meaningful step in building trust between North Korea and the United States, and hoped that this would lead to work towards a settled peace on the Korean Peninsula. The repatriation of remains is one of the points stipulated in the joint statement signed by Kim Jong and Trump in Singapore last month. That Pyongyang is following through on that promise has given hope to many that progress will be made also on denuclearization and a security guarantee from the United States. 이지원, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, South and North Korea have decided to hold another round of talks between their generals next Tuesday at the border village of Panmunjom. South Korea's defense ministry announced the talks this morning, saying the North suggested them first. They'll take place at the Peace House on the South Korean side of the border village. And it's expected they'll discuss ways to ease military tensions as agreed in the Panmunjom Declaration in April. The two sides will be led by the same officials as last month's talks, Major General Kim Do-gyun from the south and Lieutenant General An Ik-san from the north, who are of equivalent rank. And this afternoon, South Korea's defense ministry has finally announced its long-awaited plan for military reform. It aims to use technology to build a more versatile, efficient, and effective fighting force. It's a comprehensive plan called Defense Reform 2.0 that'll cost around $240 billion over the next 5 years. Mandatory service will be shortened for all branches of the military by 2 or 3 months, for example, in the Army and Marines from 21 months down to 18. By 2022, the number of troops will be reduced from the current 620,000 servicemen and women to 500,000. It'll also increase the number of women in the ranks and reduce the number of generals. And South Korea will continue to pursue its three-axis defense, that is, the kill chain preemptive strike system, the Korean Air and Missile Defense, or KAMD, and the Korea Massive Punishment and Retaliation System. It's been confirmed that South Korea's Minister of Unification, Roh Moohyun, spoke on the phone Wednesday with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. The Unification Ministry said this morning that the call did take place. It's a pretty unexpected move, though, considering that Pompeo's direct counterpart here, Foreign Minister Kim Jong, had met with Pompeo in the U.S. as recently as last week. It's unclear exactly what they talked about. The Unification Ministry says they covered denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula and the progress in inter-Korean relations. But considering that South Korea has been asking for exemptions to international sanctions on the North in order to promote inter-Korean exchanges, there's speculation that Washington wanted to confirm with the Unification Minister that those exchanges are not getting ahead of Pyongyang's denuclearization. In other news, the Bank of Korea has submitted a report to the National Assembly explaining the key economic issues, both domestic and global, that need to be considered in the months to come when deciding policy. Won Jung-hwan reports.
The Korean Central Bank has highlighted the trade dispute between Washington and Beijing, U.S. monetary policy, and Korea's domestic jobs market as the main concerns for the South Korean economy. In a report submitted at a parliamentary briefing on Friday, the Bank of Korea said the deepening trade dispute between the U.S. and China could harm the Korean economy. Amid the rising tensions between its two main trading partners, Korea's exports have already edged down by 0.1% in June, marking the second fall in exports in 20 months. The report also cites U.S. interest rates as one of the financial market variables. Last month, the Fed raised its benchmark fund rate to between 1.75% and 2%, and signaled it will raise rates twice more before the end of this year. Despite the interest rate increases having a limited effect on the Korean economy so far, the upcoming U.S. rate hikes are leading to calls that the Korean Central Bank should do the same and raise its 1.5% rate in August or November. The central bank also highlights the need for more measures to boost job creation. Between January and June, an average of 142,000 new jobs were added each month, the slowest growth since the 2008 global financial crisis. But the report does forecast some recovery in the automobile and shipbuilding industries next year. The BOK has recently lowered the country's annual growth rate for this year to 2.9%, down of 0.1% from the target 3%. Won Jung-hwan, Arirang News.
And it's been incredibly hot this month in Korea, as it has in many parts of the world. That would normally mean heading to the beach or the pool, but a lot of people here are finding other ways to go and other places to go and other ways to cool down. Our Go Ryun-hee has this report.
The intense heat in South Korea is changing how some people are spending their summer vacation. Here at Gyeongpo Beach in Gangneung, Gangwon-do Province, people are huddling under big beach umbrellas to escape the blazing sun. But aside from a dip in the sea, where can you cool off? One of the most popular spots is Hwam Cave, located in Cheongseon, Gangwon-do Province. This place used to be a gold mine and was in operation from 1922 to 1945. Natural stalactites were found inside, and it was later developed for tourists. According to an employee, this summer has brought more visitors than last year because people like the cooler air. If you venture inside this cave, the mercury dips to a refreshing 11 degrees Celsius. It's almost 20 degrees cooler than the sizzling temperature outside in Cheongseon.
We heard that this cave is cool and refreshing, but I am actually cold right now. My kids even had to wear jackets.
It's both entertaining and educational for kids who can watch these little goblin characters explain the process of gold mining. Visitors can also learn about the mine's history, how Koreans were forced to work here during Japan's colonial rule. If it's too chilly in the cave, another option is Anbandegi village in Gangneung. It's a farm village located at an altitude of 1,100 meters. So you can not only feel the breeze, but also get an astonishing view of the endless cabbage fields.
Because this place is located at a high altitude, it's really cool here, especially in the shade.
And when the sun goes down, it's time for stargazing, which some people don't mind doing for hours.
I wanted to visit somewhere new rather than the well-known beaches. I came here to look at the beautiful stars and relieve my stress.
The heat in South Korea is likely to continue for a while, so for many holidaymakers looking to cool off, it's time to think outside the box. 고륜이, Arirang News, 강릉.
I'm Devin Whiting, and those are this hour's news headlines.
Today marks the 65th anniversary of the Korean War Armistice Agreement. But now talk of ending that armistice and formally declaring the end of the Korean War is being discussed. South Korea has expressed its desire for it to happen by the end of this year, but North Korea and the US are still colliding on whether the steps for denuclearization have to come first before agreeing on a peace treaty. Roh Janghee has this report.
The Korean War ended with an armistice agreement in 1953, and since then, Korea remains the only divided nation in the world. The people of the two Koreas live facing each other over a heavily militarized border. It's not a complete peace on the Korean peninsula, but a temporary ceasefire continuing for over 6 decades. 65 years have passed since the 1953 armistice agreement, and the two Koreas are moving to formally end that decades-long war. There was a previous attempt after the 2007 Inter-Korean Summit, but the latest attempt is stronger and is gaining much momentum as it was reaffirmed through the first ever North Korea-US summit, and the two Koreas have set a specific deadline of within this year. July 27th, the anniversary of the armistice agreement, was seen as the most plausible date. But the overall process slowed down as Pyongyang and Washington faced the question of what has to come first. Washington is cautious about declaring the end of the war as it may get rid of military options to pressure the North to denuclearize. But Pyongyang wants the declaration first as that gives the regime a security guarantee.
The US is concerned that North Korea may demand the withdrawal of US forces from South Korea, but North Korea won't ever accept a deal where it has to abandon all of its nukes first. Seoul should call on North Korea to come up with a detailed denuclearization schedule while speaking to the US about how they'll reward the regime throughout the process. And the declaration on ending the war should cover denuclearization as well to satisfy Washington.
Pundits add a war doesn't come to a formal end with a declaration only. It has to be stipulated in the peace treaty. The declaration itself does not have a legal binding power, but gives an assurance that the related parties will cooperate, which could accelerate North Korea's denuclearization.
The goals of denuclearization and a peace treaty are both too big to deal with. It's difficult to decide which has to be done first. The reason why the Panmunjom Declaration stipulated declaring an end to the Korean War within this year was to give North Korea an assurance as soon as possible that South Korea and the US are taking confidence-building measures on their part. North Korea needs a reason to denuclearize, and declaring an end to the war provides that reason.
Watchers point out that the two Koreas could first end an unusual decades-long armistice and then settle on technical issues through a peace treaty afterwards. The foreign ministers of the two Koreas, the US and possibly China, could discuss the matter when they attend the ASEAN Regional Forum in Singapore next week. Roh Janghee, Arirang News.
Now, joining us in the studio to talk more about the armistice agreement and its significance is Dr. Lee Janghee from the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Dr. Lee, thank you for coming in today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here.
Today marks the 65th anniversary of the Korean War Armistice Agreement, as we saw in that last report. But perhaps this year there's a bit more significance because of all the talk about ending it and working towards a peace treaty. But before we get to that, can you briefly tell our viewers about the significance of the Armistice Agreement?
Yeah, as you know, the armistice is just temporal termination of war. Since 1953, so Korean armistice was longest armistice in the history of armistice history. So during this time, our people have a terrible the division and the terrible separation. So after the Panmunjom Declaration, we have a historical opportunity to ending of the war.
Can you, the armistice agreement is obviously different from a peace treaty.
Yes.
And also it's different from the declaration of ending the war as well. Can you explain a bit about what the differences are and how how two nations would go from an armistice to a peace treaty?
Yeah, so the armistice is just the temporal termination of war, but the peace treaty is the final legally termination of war. So the armistice during the armistice it's a kind of the wartime, but during the peace treaty it's kind of the peacetime. So both are quite different. So during the armistice time, the relation between the two countries are so hostile state, but during the peacetime, it's a kind of the normalization between two countries.
Do you know, I mean, can you explain as well, also getting from a armistice to a peace treaty, like how does it go about, how does that happen, do you know?
Yeah, it's not simple to explain, but you know, in the long time ago, we tried this armistice into the peace treaty. As you know, we have already the 1992, the basic treaty between the South and North Korea, Article 5. So in spite of that agreement, in the meantime, we had a confrontation in the very the Cold War times. But I think this year we have very historical opportunity to ending of the war, from the armistice to the peace treaty.
It's not the first time we've been close. We've tried to make some sort of armistice, ending the armistice before. Perhaps the closest we got was in 2007 between ex-President Roh Moohyun and Kim Jong when they met for their summit back then. But that didn't end up going the way we wanted it to. Why did that end up that way?
Yeah, since 2007, in southern side, the conservative government come to power. So this agreement didn't implemented. So our policy was changed into the press policy toward against North Korea. So conservative government didn't recognize the 2007 the Smith meeting declaration totally.
So I guess right now with President Moon Jae-in, he's got a few more years to try and make this happen. Perhaps it is a very good opportunity, as you say.
Yes, yeah, especially after the declaration about Panmunjom Declaration in April this year, we have a very, very wonderful historical event. You know, the North Korea leader Kim Jong, he himself would like to try the ending of war and furthermore the peace treaty. And also following the meeting, the June 12, the Smith meeting between the North Korea and the USA, it would be very important for the ending of war on the Korean Peninsula.
I think it's especially different this time as well because North Korea have been so open about trying to end the war, and they've been showing good signs towards the US. For example, earlier today, there was the return of the remains of US soldiers killed in the Korean War. Now that took a long time to get there, but it's finally happened. Will North Korea, what do you make of the fact that North Korea gave back the remains now?
Yeah, it could be very good, the meaning for the good normalization between the North Korea and the USA. So, the soldiers remains during the Korean War were already agreed in the last June 12, the summit meeting between the North Korea and the USA, the Article 4. Of course, among the argument, there are very important other 3 points. One point is the denuclearization. The other point is the ending of the hostility. Thirdly, the normalization between two countries. But lastly, the retrain the soldiers remains during the Korean War. But this time, it was implemented.
That first point now of denuclearization is the biggest point right now. The US are saying they want denuclearization first before they give a peace treaty, but the North Koreans are saying we can't give denuclearization unless there is a peace treaty. There's the two conflicting sides. But with North Korea showing good signs towards the US now, does it put pressure on the US to perhaps consider at least formally ending the Korean War?
Yeah, as you know, the North Korea wanted really the peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. But the USA wanted denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. But the USA complained the denuclearization development is too much slow. So in this context, North Korea also want the fast ending of the war and the declaration of a war. But this time, this kind of the returning of the remains of the war remain returning, it could be good meaning for the development between the two countries.
If the Korean War is declared over and they do sign some sort of declaration confirming that, what happens next? What happens next? What are the good sides and bad sides? What are the US afraid of?
USA concerned the denuclearization development. I think it takes the 2.5 years for the denuclearization. But the public opinion in the USA is very impatient. You know, the Mr. President Trump, the middle election is coming. But the New York Times and the Washington Post complain Mr. Trump is an idiot. But how can he win this middle election? So Mr. Trump is very impatient.
What about South Korea in all this? I mean, South Korea obviously wasn't one of the people who signed the original armistice, but right now, I mean, they are the main, one of the main parties involved, obviously, the Korean War between the two sides. But what does South Korea and President Moon Jae-in now have to do? How does he play the mediator, the middleman in this situation?
Yeah, you mean the role of the South Korea?
Yes.
Yeah, of course, South Korea should be the very important role for the promoting this kind of development between the denuclearization and the ending of the war. But nevertheless, you know, there are some limitations. There are the UN sanction. You know, within the UN sanction, the South Korea also asking and order want the United States government. You know, still the US sanction is very strict. The England and some country are very strictly asking the denuclearization against North Korea.
Well, what do you think about the good side? I mean, for South Korea, what could there be? You know, how do they push this forward then? What do they need to be careful of? How do they do this?
Yeah, the South Korea should have more talking with the expert in the USA and also the public opinion in the United States. finally the North Korea could denuclearize on the Korean Peninsula. But it takes the time because the North Korea have still some mistrust about the USA. You know, before that, last year we imagine USA very often say the preemptive strike, a surgical strike, is kind of very threatening against the North Korea regime.
Well, we're out of time, unfortunately, Dr. Lee, but as you said, there is perhaps now finally hope at the end of the tunnel, light at the end of the tunnel for working towards a peace treaty, but it will take some time, possibly.
Yeah, I think it takes some time.
Thank you for coming in, and thank you for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you.
That's all from me. However, do stay tuned to Arirang for our later newscasts. I'll be back on Monday, but in the meantime, hope you have a good weekend, and thank you for watching. Goodbye.